Madam Speaker.
The member for Darling Range.
Good afternoon, evening, Madam Speaker. I join all of my colleagues in this place, and indeed the people of Western Australia and further afar, in congratulating you on your elevation to the role of Speaker. I acknowledge the example you've set for the many women and girls in Western Australia who may have until recently wavered in considering a career of service in this place. Your indulgence in batting away the odd Mr. Speaker does remind me of the progress of women in the Navy over the last 30 years, where the subordinates were conditioned through practice to reference their captain as Sir, and had to learn to say Captain Ma'am when seeking attention from the women that obtained command, probably with a less forgiving response than they got if they got it wrong than you're providing. In fact, I joined the Navy at a time of the first intake of a male-dominated category, the boatswain's mates, when females were first recruited to that branch, and they were then known as quartermaster gunners. And then I was lucky enough to serve with the first female warrant officer boatswain, the highest rank in that category, in my last posting in the Navy. Her name is Shirley Folkes, and she was an outstanding professional and caring senior sailor, and I wish I had the opportunity to serve at sea with her. I rise for the first time as a newly elected member for Darling Range, and wish to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land in which we meet and the land in which Darling Range is situated, the Whadjuk and Nala Kala Budja peoples of the Noongar Nation, their elders past, present and emerging. I'd also like to acknowledge the previous member for Darling Range, the Honourable Alyssa Hayden, and thank her for her advocacy for the community. I wish Alyssa and her husband Terry all the best for their future endeavours. I'm so very honoured and privileged to have been chosen to represent the people of such a diverse and expansive electorate with immense natural beauty, and one that is undergoing probably the most significant investment in infrastructure and in housing development that has ever experienced. I'm certain, as are many others, as it was said after the election results, it must be true, that I was primarily elected as an endorsement of Mark McGowan's leadership and outstanding performance of the government over the last 4 years, and I agree. However, I will work very hard to repay the faith in me and the McGowan government and earn the trust of the people to represent Darling Range in my own right. Many people will talk about their humble beginnings, but I and my two sisters, Sarah and Jackie, were very fortunate to have wanted for nothing when we were growing up in North Wales, except perhaps warm weather. My sisters had horses, and I had a motorbike, so I'm thinking about something else. And we had the love of our parents. Our ancestors are Welsh coal and slate miners, farm hands and domestic servants. However, our parents worked hard to improve their economic outlook through education and training opportunities. My mum, Peggy, was the daughter of an ironmonger and a domestic servant, and her father passed away when she was only 10 years old. Mum went on to complete nursing training at Liverpool Royal Infirmary, and it was in Liverpool where she met my father, Trevor, who was studying dentistry at the University of Liverpool. Dad was a son of a taxi driver and a World War I veteran and a hotel proprietor. Unlike Mum, Dad lost his own father when he was only 7 years old, and that was to the lingering effects of mustard gas. Dad had a brother who died at age 4 before my dad was born, and a sister who died at age 5. The personal story of loss of life at a young age through war and disease impacting families in the early 20th century is common, but it's still worth reflecting upon when considering our own situation and the risk posed to our own families should we fail to manage the various strains of coronavirus that threaten us, despite our advances in medical science. Our family chose to migrate to Western Australia, arriving in Perth on Australia Day 1978. I recall it was a very hot day, and according to the records, reached a maximum of 35 degrees. I vividly remember, at the age of 11, the taxi ride from the airport to the city, a long riverside drive, and marvelling at the palm trees that are still there today. It reminded me of exotic locations, usually American, possibly Florida, that I'd seen on TV as a child. We stayed in a motel just down from this place on St George's Terrace, and my father brought our first car from a car yard just around the corner on Milligan Street. It was a huge HQ Holden with a bench seat on the front. We very soon learned the hazards associated with vinyl seats and seatbelt buckles against naked legs in the summer heat. Again, the big car reminded me of America and the promise of prosperity and a better future. My own schooling was relatively uneventful, but I do remember initially being teased about my accent. It no doubt had an effect, and my worst embarrassment at school was being forced to participate in a debate to which I only contributed one sentence. Such is my fear of public speaking, but I'm better now. Our own integration into Western Australia was easy in comparison to others who perhaps had the wrong skin shade or cultural and religious differences. My friend and now colleague, the Honourable Dr. Tony Booty, Minister for Finance, who's unable to be here this evening, he recounted in his inaugural address that his father and indeed himself had suffered discrimination based upon their Italian heritage, and it has since disappeared. I personally like Italians. They make beautiful motorcycles and outstanding finance, transport and police ministers. It's my observation that the migrations of various groups to Australia, such as Italian, Greek, Vietnamese and Indian, were initially met with resistance, mistrust and the associated discrimination. But that there seems to be a period of probation, perhaps a generation, until they are accepted and their contribution is recognised. They want the same things as those already here: peace and prosperity, and a great place to raise their children. For some reason, the cycle of acceptance has not been applied to the First Nations people of this great country. They have accepted, or have had no choice other than to accept, all those that came after. But in many quarters, they're not themselves accepted. Our First Nations people continue to be locked up at atrocious rates, suffering increased rates of violence, increased burden of disease, reduced participation in schooling and the workforce, and I'll do what I can to assist this government to continue its work towards closing the gap. We all have a role to play, calling out racism wherever we see and hear it, and giving people a hand up. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge the work of the First Nations Homelessness Project, in which I and my sister Sarah volunteered for a few brief months, and its champions Jennifer Kashagan and her husband Jerry Georgatis and their daughter Connie Georgatis, who do vital work keeping First Nations families housed and supported, recognising that homelessness for children has devastating and irreversible effects. After I left school, I was employed in a variety of jobs, from work as a laboratory assistant at Murdoch University Vet School to the then named State Electricity Commission, mapping out and cataloguing every part of Kwinana Power Station down to valve, model and serial number. I also worked for a time as a motorcycle courier with employment conditions similar to those now experienced in the gig economy, where you have no mandated breaks for meals or respite, no requirement for safety equipment except for a helmet, that's only because it's the law, and the implicit encouragement to travel fast, take risks, split lanes, and to work tired in all weather. In order to earn anything near a living wage, earn anything near a living wage, I understand that some food delivery drivers are clearing as little as $10 an hour. I did become rather skillful on the bike, but I took far too many risks, having at least 2 falls, but luckily without any serious injury. I applaud and will support the efforts of the Transport Workers Union to represent drivers and riders towards achieving a safer and fairer workplace. I'll also do what I can to advocate for motorcycle safety, cognisant that there are cultural and behavioural factors that prevent a purely objective solution. In October 1990, just prior to the commencement of the First Gulf War, I decided that I needed a change in direction in my life and some self-discipline, and enlisted in the Royal Australian Navy, one of the many fortunate decisions I've made in life. I signed on the dotted line for 4 years, which at the time did seem rather a large commitment, rather like a term in Parliament. I did, however, end up remaining in the Navy for 30 years and thoroughly enjoyed every minute. The Navy does teach you what anyone would expect it teaches you: discipline, teamwork and technical skills. The technical skills I initially learned were to touch type to 35 words a minute, which has paid off handsomely, but I also spent months learning Morse code at ever-increasing speeds. The utility of that skill has been completely lost, except the odd quiz night. The real skills I learned during my time in the Navy, particularly at sea, was how to get along with people. You learn the art of empathy, either in its generally accepted definition or as a consequences of your actions or inaction. If you treat someone poorly, take credit for something that you didn't do yourself, or blame someone for something you did, it comes back to bite you quickly. News travels fast on the ship. Reputations can be destroyed in a moment, and you can't always go home at the end of the day. Another important life lesson I learned in the Navy was to look after your troops. There is the obvious requirement of food and shelter, but it's really about identifying their skills and getting the best out of them. It's about recognising people who are doing a great job. It might not be perfect all the time, but take or make the time to highlight the good. The present Chief of Navy, Vice Admiral Michael Noonan, AO, back in 1997, he was my boss. He encouraged me, well, he still was my boss at the end, I suppose, technically, encouraged me to commission from the ranks, and I'm eternally indebted to him, and quite frankly remain loyal to him to this day. I see parallels to this as a Member of Parliament. It's so very important to recognise the achievements of people in the electorate and wider WA, be they volunteers involved in business or state and local government employees, encouraging them in their endeavours and resisting the urge to bask in their glory, their reflected glory, or to call them out when things aren't always perfect. I then met my lovely wife, Cam, and where else would a sailor meet a lady to marry but a pub? In this instant, the moon and sixpence was no longer there. This encounter changed our lives forever and later created 2 more lives. I was previously a fairly self-centred individual, more interested in being at sea with 100 or so close mates and spending my money on motorcycles, but my outlook changed. We soon settled down, got married, and tomorrow's our 21st.
Congratulations.
And started our own little family. My beautiful daughter Grace came along to instantly erase any idea of being self-centred and sparked a nurturing attitude I didn't know that I had. Grace was and still is very bright and compassionate, and is presently completing an honours degree at Curtin University, continuing to make us proud. Grace was also a great help during my campaign, getting me up to speed with social media. And Grace's boyfriend, Zach, is an electrical apprentice and a fine young man, and Cam and I approve. Our son Griff was born a little while later. He wasn't progressing as well as Grace had, although she had met the milestones more quickly than average. A friend of ours, Philip Crossley, had experience working in group accommodation for people with special needs, in particular those with autism. Although a very difficult subject to raise, Phil did suggest to us that we have Griff assessed, as he thought he was displaying some traits. We were just about to relocate to Canberra, so we waited until we were there to progress what we were hesitant to do. The district nurse told Kim that Griff was just progressing a little more slowly and there was nothing to worry about. In any event, we had him assessed and Griff was on the spectrum. Although we'd already talked ourselves into the likelihood, it was nonetheless traumatic. And I've been in a state of grief ever since. We returned to WA 2 years later and were lucky enough to enrol Griff at Kenwick School for early intervention. This went quite well, but we were told his IQ was too high for him to remain in Kenwick School. So we had to go to a mainstream school, which meant Kelmscott Primary School, where his sister Grace was attending. This didn't go very well because Griff lacked the ability to comprehend written and verbal instructions and to adequately express himself. And after some battling with red tape, we were able to successfully argue for Griff to return to Kenwick School, which equipped him with the skills that we would expect. I also fought for Griff to become eligible for the disability support pension, and recall leaving the post office in tears as I couldn't provide a photo ID. As a relatively competent person, I felt so helpless at the time. I could relate to the frustration of people with disabilities and their advocates when they navigate their way through the bureaucracy. Griff has been fortunate to receive great support from the school, from Kenwick School, Mr Mark Watson, the principal, and his staff, and he was made job ready. And he gained employment in a supported workplace. The wages that people receive in these places are very low, Madam Speaker. Griff earns just $3.57 an hour. However, this gives him purpose and a safe place to work. And his income is supplemented by the disability support pension. The consequence of such a low wage is that although working full-time for 16 months, his superannuation balance is just $226. Now, Griff will be okay because he's got me and Cam to look after him. But other people who haven't necessarily got families to look after them are not in a good way. Request an extension, please.
Extension granted, member.
My wife Cam has, of course, had the same experiences and more as she was juggling the care of our children with the pursuit of her own career whilst I was away at sea. Cam was born in Vietnam and entered Australia under a refugee program in the early 1980s after being held in detention in Malaysia. Her family would have endured the same racism and discrimination that was directed towards other boat people back then. However, her family has gone on to become citizens and great contributors to Western Australia. Cam completed her primary school teaching degree with Curtin University, studying full-time at night classes held at Armadale TAFE, whilst looking after 2 children and working during the day as an education assistant, often when I was away at sea. I don't know how she managed, but she did, and did it well. My arrival in politics was not anticipated, nor a long-standing goal. Anyone who witnessed my debating effort in school would have rightly suggested that I would be the last person in the room to get into politics. But with encouragement from people like Vice Admiral Noonan, I came out of my shell. Oh, loud. Another such person is a good friend to many, the Honourable Dr Tony Booty, member for Armadale, who's now been justifiably elevated to the ministry. I would not be standing here today were it not for Tony. Tony is one of those people I aspire to be, someone who seeks to elevate others and bring people along, without an expectation of anything in return. I first met Tony when he was door knocking, despite there being no Liberal candidate for the 2010 election for the seat of Armadale. Tony impressed me as a kind and compassionate man, and after quite some time and several interactions, he suggested I join the Labor Party. Throughout his terms in Parliament, the member for Armadale has continued to take an interest in our family and made us feel special. I want to thank Tony in particular for encouraging me, a sometimes shy participant in life, to run for Darling Range. I have so many other people to thank for my arrival in this place. Of course, I must first thank my wonderfully supportive wife Cam and our children Grace and Griff, who gave me permission to run. Probably not realising just how much time a campaign consumes, and certainly not aware of the commitment that we all have now undertaken. It will be fun, I promise. I can never thank Cam enough for all she's done for me. My mother Peggy and father Trevor similarly encouraged me, as they've done all my life, as did my sisters Jackie and Sarah, who are both nurses. Sarah is now retired, but Jackie works in a regional hospital emergency department, as she's done for a very long time. I'm truly in awe of the work that they have both done, fronting up day after day, despite the trauma, pain and suffering that they saw the shift before. All emergency service personnel have earned and deserve our respect. And I commend the McGowan government and you, Madam Speaker, in your former role as Police Minister, for the introduction of a new compensation scheme for medically retired West Australian police officers and Aboriginal police liaison officers. I also thank the member for Riverton, Dr Jaggs, and his former colleagues, Mr Raj Selvendra and Dr Paddy Ramanathan, for their support throughout the campaign. Three kinder and more generously supportive gentlemen you will not find. I'm very thankful for the support provided by the union movement, including the SDA and the CFMEU. Unions are filled with highly principled, tireless and compassionate people who work to ensure that workers' rights are maintained and enhanced. They ensure that workers receive a fair day's pay for a fair day's work, and that employers provide a workplace that is safe so that workers arrive back home healthy at the end of a shift or a swing. You only have to take a stroll across to Solidarity Park to view the memorials for many people, most of whom had their whole lives ahead of them, to see the consequences of workplaces without adequate safety standards and supervision. Terrible and avoidable losses of life. I especially want to thank Mr Mick Buchan and Mr Steve Catania of the CFMEU, who provided me with material support throughout the campaign, and Mr Simon Stokes, whose cheery disposition and skills in acting and video production made the long days on pre-poll and door-knocking enjoyable, and the video recordings less daunting. Thank you very much to the CFMEU and its members. I'd also like to mention Peter O'Keefe and Ben Harris of the SDA, who provided me with great support, and they too give their all for their membership. I enjoyed great support from young Labor members who endured long hot days of door-knocking and phone banking without reward other than a cup of coffee or a piece of pizza. At risk of missing some people, I'd especially like to thank Adam, James, Kiara, Luke, Connor, Harrison, Christopher, Will, Hayley, Dan, John, Fatima and Denise, who were willing to give their time up for the cause. To the many people, union and party members and not, who supported me throughout the pre-poll period and on polling day, you have my sincere thanks for giving up your precious spare time. To the team at party headquarters, Tim, Ellie and Hugo, and the countless others who provided support and on the odd occasion, strong encouragement to lift my game, I thank you. You ran a great campaign. My own campaign team were also magnificent, directed at different times by the Honourable Matt Swinburne, MLC, Member for East Metro, the Honourable Dr Tony Booty and Mr Steve Catania, who not only gave up their valuable time and effort, but in doing so impinged on the time they could enjoy with their own families. Thank you, gentlemen, and thank you to your families. My campaign manager, Jess Connold, although a very young man, showed great skill in putting the campaign together. He was being pulled from pillar to post by competing priorities from the Good Ideas Club, but he kept motivated and kept me on task. Thank you, Jess. I also want to acknowledge Tina, Judith, Jill, Veronica, Bodie, Joel and Rod, who were all integral to my campaign. Special mention to Mitchell Goff, my wingman, who kept me motivated and working hard for the home stretch. Thank you all. My field organisers were simply amazing. Despite Emily Marr and Tom Marr being the parents of a very young child, Dorothy, and juggling study and employment, they were always out there, often at the same time, driving me and the other volunteers to knock just one more door or to make one more phone call. Their commitment and that of the other young Labor volunteers gives me confidence that this generation is no different to those of yesteryear. They will work hard for what they believe in. I often received feedback about the conduct of the field and booth teams, and it was always positive. My volunteers all conducted themselves with maturity, with respect and with dignity. Thank you for being the public face of Hugh Jones and WA Labor in Darling Range. You did yourselves proud. And to the many members of Parliament who supported me, I won't go through them all, but you know who you are, and I thank you. I'm in your debt. And of course the Premier, the Leader, who along with his Cabinet and the Labor members of the 40th Parliament demonstrated to the electorate that WA Labor had earned re-election and were to be trusted to take this great state forward. I first met the Premier back in 1992 whilst we were both in the Navy, and we were selected to go to Newcastle to play squash. It was a tough job. And then again when the Premier door knocked on my house in Safety Bay before the 2001 election. And just for the benefit of the record, the Premier was a slightly better player at squash than I was. Thank you, Premier, for endorsing my selection and allowing me to assist you in governing this great state of WA. As I mentioned at the start, Darling Range is expansive at almost 1,400 square kilometres and includes urban, peri-urban and rural populations, with the Serpentine-Jarrahdale local government area rated as the fastest growing in WA and perhaps Australia. Perhaps the third fastest in Australia. The housing boom, assisted by building stimulus measures, is resulting in rapid population growth, in the main by young families seeking affordable housing and needing quality education, health facilities and transport corridors. To support the families to gain access to this boom, I'm pleased that the McGowan government has a new WA jobs plan based upon reducing interstate FIFO, more training through TAFE in schools and diversifying the state's economy. The freezing of TAFE fees and the local infrastructure investments, as well as improved public transport and the capping of fares to 2 zones, will assist the residents of Darling Range to achieve their education and employment goals. The Shire of Serpentine-Jarrahdale is finding it difficult to keep pace with the development. Especially notable is the ageing rural road network, and I'm pleased that the state government will contribute $18 million to assist in the upgrade of local roads to improve safety. The Shire's strong advocacy during the 40th Parliament has realised significant commitments from the McGowan government and will help foster a strong working relationship in the 41st. The McGowan government has made significant investment in the commitments for transport infrastructure, including the Byford Rail extension, as well as the contribution to and delivery of the Tonkin Highway extension and improvements of Thomas Road. I want to again recognise the Minister for Transport, the Honourable Rita Saffioti, who is overseeing an enormous program of infrastructure investment, skillfully bringing together industry, federal, state and local governments across this state, but especially for Darling Range, displaying great vision to meet our needs now and into the future. Thank you. I'm also pleased that the McGowan government will deliver a $30.6 million health hub in the heart of Byford, a new career fire station and investment in schools throughout Darling Range. It's an exciting time to be the member of Darling Range, and it will have its challenges. I will undertake to work in cooperation with the federal, state and local governments to ensure there is wide-ranging consultation throughout the planning stages of these developments to achieve the best results I can for the people of Darling Range. I again thank the people of Darling Range for placing their trust in me, and I, assisted by my new staff members, Bella Fitzpatrick and Glenda Bourne, will do our very best to give them the representation they all deserve. The legendary Australian combat cameraman, Neil Davis, used to write the following 2 lines from a poem by Thomas Mordaunt into the flyleaf of every work diary in the conflict zones he covered in Southeast Asia. One crowded hour of glorious life is worth an age without a name. Members, let's be glorious and take this great state forward. Thank you.